The snowstorm raged outside, its icy winds battering the walls of Daniel's cabin. Inside, the retired forest ranger sat in his living room, the glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows across the room. The blizzard had isolated him for days, and the silence was only broken by the occasional crack of the logs in the fire. Then a sound pierced the stillness, a faint, desperate scratching. Daniel frowned, setting down his mug of coffee. He listened carefully. There it was again, this time accompanied by a muffled whimper. He stood, his heart beginning to race. The sound was coming from the front door. Walking cautiously toward the entrance, Daniel's eyes widened as he approached the glass door. There, framed against the swirling snow, stood a bobcat. Her body trembled from the cold, and pressed tightly against her were two tiny cubs, barely visible beneath her protective stance. Frost clung to her fur, and her breath came out in visible puffs as she gazed at Daniel with eyes full of desperation. Daniel froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He knew opening the door could mean bringing trouble into his home, but as her gaze met his, something deep within him stirred. The decision he was about to make would change their lives forever. His heart pounded as he stood motionless in front of the door. The storm raged behind the trembling bobcat. Her breath fogged up the frosted glass, her body hunched over, shielding the two tiny cubs that clung to her side. Their small bodies were almost buried under the snow accumulating around them. He could see her ribs pressing through her matted fur, her eyes pleading with a mix of fear and hope. "What the hell happened to you?" Daniel whispered to himself, his breath misting in the cold air inside the room. Instinctively, he reached for the doorknob. The moment the door creaked open, the icy wind surged into the cabin, carrying the storm's unforgiving chill. The bobcat didn't move, her paws still planted firmly in the snow. She remained frozen in place, her gaze fixed on Daniel as if unsure whether to trust him. "Come on, girl, get in here," Daniel coaxed, crouching down to make himself less intimidating. "You'll freeze to death out there." The bobcat let out a soft whimper, glancing briefly at her cubs before stepping forward, her movements slow and cautious. She nudged one of the cubs with her nose, urging them to follow. The smaller of the two stumbled in the snow, its tiny legs struggling to keep up. Without hesitation, the mother gently picked it up by the scruff and carried it inside, followed closely by the second cub. As soon as they were inside, Daniel shut the door behind them, blocking out the storm's relentless roar. The sudden warmth of the cabin caused the bobcat to tremble more violently, her body adjusting to the temperature shift. Daniel grabbed an old blanket from the couch and gently draped it over her and the cubs. She flinched at first, but realizing he meant no harm, let out a long, shaky sigh and lay down near the fire, curling protectively around her cubs. Daniel knelt beside her, his mind racing. The cubs were tiny, their eyes barely open. They were so frail that he could see their little chests rise and fall with labored breaths. He reached out to touch one, but the mother's low growl stopped him. It wasn't aggressive, just a warning, a reminder that she was still wary of him. All right, Daniel murmured, raising his hands in surrender. "You're a good mom. You've been through hell, haven't you?" He stood and grabbed a bowl from the kitchen, filling it with warm water. Placing it near the bobcat, he stepped back, giving her space. She eyed him warily but eventually leaned forward, lapping at the water as her cubs huddled closer to her side. Daniel watched from a distance, his thoughts swirling. Where had she come from? How had she ended up in the middle of a blizzard with two newborns? Her condition suggested she had been on her own for a while, long enough to grow weak and desperate, but not enough to give up. The fact that she had made it this far, carrying her cubs through the storm, was nothing short of a miracle. But now what? Daniel wasn't prepared for this. He had always respected wildlife, but his life had taken a quiet turn in retirement. The idea of caring for a wild bobcat and her cubs, especially ones in such dire need, was overwhelming. Still, As he looked at the mother's exhausted frame and the way she curled protectively around her cubs, he knew he couldn't turn them away. "You've got a fighter spirit. I'll give you that," Daniel said softly. "Guess that makes two of us." As the night wore on, Daniel worked to make them more comfortable. He laid out towels for the cubs, placed a bowl of food near the mother, and stoked a fire to keep the room warm. The bobcat watched him closely, her eyes tracking his every move. But as the hours passed, her posture began to relax. For the first time, she let her head rest on the blanket, her eyes fluttering shut. Daniel sat in his chair, the fire crackling softly beside him, and couldn't help but feel a strange sense of purpose. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for now, he had done what he could. As the storm raged on outside, he made a silent promise to the mother and her cubs. They were safe, and he wouldn't let anything happen to them. The next morning, Daniel awoke to the faint sound of soft whimpers and the crackling fire that had burned low during the night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a blanket of snow that glistened in the early morning sunlight. He rubbed his eyes, his mind immediately shifting to the unexpected guests who had sought refuge in his home. Turning toward the fireplace, he saw the bobcat still curled around her cubs. The cubs stirred slightly, their tiny bodies wriggling under her protective embrace. The mother's ears twitched at the sound of Daniel's movements, and her amber eyes opened, locking onto his. There was still a guarded look in her gaze, but it lacked the desperation of the night before. "Morning, girl," Daniel said gently as he stretched and walked toward the kitchen. "Let's see if we can get you something to eat." He rummaged through his pantry, grabbing a can of chicken soup. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Daniel warmed it up on the stove and carefully placed a bowl near her. She lifted her head, sniffing the air cautiously, and after a moment began to eat. The cubs, sensing their mother's movement, let out small cries and tried to nuzzle closer to her warmth. Daniel knelt down a few feet away, watching as she ate. "You're a tough one," he said softly. "Carrying those little ones through that storm, you deserve better than this." As the morning wore on, Daniel took stock of their condition. The mother was visibly malnourished, her ribs stark against her thin frame. The cubs, while frail, seemed to have enough fight in them to try to nurse, their tiny tails wagging slightly as they latched onto their mother. Daniel's heart ached at the sight. He had seen his share of hardship during his years as a ranger, but there was something uniquely heartbreaking about the quiet struggle of these animals. Deciding to help further, Daniel made a quick call to the local wildlife center. "This is Daniel King," he said when the receptionist answered. "I've got a bobcat and her two cubs here. They're in bad shape. Think you could take a look at them?" The receptionist's voice was warm but firm. "Of course, Mr. King. Bring them over, and we'll do what we can." Daniel hung up, relieved. He glanced at the bobcat, who was now licking her cubs affectionately, her maternal instincts shining through despite her exhaustion. "You hear that, girl? We're going to get you some help." Getting them to the center proved to be no small task. Daniel found an old blanket and gently tried to coax the mother onto it. She hesitated, her body tense, and let out a soft growl when Daniel moved too close to her cubs. "It's okay," he reassured her, keeping his movements slow. "I'm not going to hurt them. I promise." After several minutes of gentle coaxing, she finally allowed him to lift her and the cubs into the back of his truck. Daniel secured the blanket carefully, making sure they were comfortable, before driving toward town. The roads were still icy from the storm, and Daniel drove cautiously, his mind racing with questions. Where had she come from? Was she part of a family out there, or had she been abandoned, left to fend for herself in the brutal cold? At the wildlife center, the staff moved quickly, their practiced hands examining the mother and cubs. "She's severely underweight," one of the biologists, Dr. Carter, said as he ran his hands along the bobcat's bony frame. "But she's resilient. Her cubs are lucky she made it this far." Dr. Carter glanced at Daniel, his expression thoughtful. "She's been through a lot. It'll take time for her to recover fully, but with proper care, she'll be okay." The biologist paused. Do you know where she came from? Daniel shook his head. She just showed up at my door last night. I couldn't leave her out there. The biologist smiled softly. Well, she chose the right door. By the time Daniel brought them back home, the mother seemed calmer. The cubs, now full from their feeding at the center, wriggled happily as they nestled back into her side. Daniel sat nearby, watching as the bobcat finally allowed herself to relax. She even let him sit closer, her eyes softening when he reached out to gently stroke her head. You're safe now, Daniel murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what you've been through, but you've got a place here as long as you need it. For the first time, the bobcat leaned into his touch, her body no longer rigid with fear. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. He had opened the door for her out of instinct, not knowing what would come of it. But now, seeing her trust begin to grow, he realized that they had both found something they didn't know they needed a second chance.